In this third video about network defense, we'll talk about a transition from passive traditional defenses to more active defense. As attackers keep on stepping up their game, so do we as defenders have to do the same in order to stay ahead of the game as much as we can. In CSC 280, the Introduction to Cybersecurity, we discussed the concept of cyber threat intelligence in more detail. But as a refresher, what we have seen happen over the last few years, more advanced organizations have started adopting the use of cyber threat intelligence to use as support in their decision-making efforts in terms of what their security strategy should be, who their opponents are, and what the methods and the techniques are that are used by their opponents, and consequently what type of network traffic we should anticipate and what should be blocked and not blocked. Traditionally, this used to be done all on expert opinion, but the situation is changing so rapidly and our adversaries are getting so advanced that just opinion is no longer good enough. We actually need actionable, reliable data in order to make these decisions, and that's the role of threat intelligence. So, definition-wise, threat intelligence is evidence-based knowledge used to support the making of cyber defense decisions. So, threat intelligence deals with structured information about adversaries. And that means that we have to come up with ideas about how to structure that information. And one of the most common approaches is to use a very simple model called the diamond model for intrusion analysis. Basically, what it says is if you understand who your opponent is, who your victim is, what capabilities the adversary is using to attack the victim, and what infrastructure they're using to carry out that attack, you understand enough about the process as a whole. And they all map to each other. So for example, I might know that a simple script kiddie, who is my adversary, typically looks for victims that maybe don't have their security practices as well developed as they should have. The capabilities that they use are commercial off-the-shelf malware or exploits, typically shipped through the Metasploit framework. And in terms of infrastructure, if there is any, that might be things like Google Cloud or Amazon Web Services. And that gives me a pretty solid understanding of what these attackers are trying to accomplish. Now, as we had seen in the past with other attack cycles and attack models, these attacks evolve over time. One of the most common approaches today is called the kill chain or the cyber kill chain. It's a common model that we use to understand attacks. It is just a number of phases that the attack evolves through. And the idea is that each subsequent stage depends on the previous one for an attack to be successful. And the consequence of that is that if I'm able to disrupt that cycle very early on, I have stopped the attack. So the earlier I can cut the chain, one link in the chain, the earlier I'll be able to stop the attack or limit its effectiveness. And so, where we started from reconnaissance and scanning, the cyber kill chain rolls those up into one stage called reconnaissance. After that, we called gaining access. The cyber kill chain says, no, what we have is some form of a weaponization of the attack. So that means developing malware and creating it in a point that it can be used. Then it has to be delivered and used in the end. So where we called gaining access one stage, the cyber kill chain breaks it down into weaponization, delivery, and exploitation. After successful exploitation, in other words, after access has been obtained to a system, we said, well, at that point, an attacker has three tasks. One is to hide their tracks, two is to keep their access, and three is to use the assets. And the cyber kill chain calls that installation, command and control, and actions on objective. Installation is establishing that foothold so you can get back to this and hiding your tracks. Command and control means that you can have sustained use of your infrastructure that you just compromised. And then actions on objectives is to actually carry out the things that you were there to do in the first place. The idea is that if I can develop a diamond model for each of these 7 stages, so who is doing reconnaissance, how are they doing it, what kind of infrastructure are they using for it, and against what victims do they do this? Who is developing these cyber weapons? What kind of methods and techniques are they using for it? What infrastructure are they using it for? The more that I can fill out all of those aspects of that diamond model, the better I understand the full cyber kill chain. And that means that I can now start developing intelligence, markers, indicators that I can start looking for in my own infrastructure to determine, am I a victim? Or is my infrastructure being used to facilitate these attacks? And that's, of course, valuable information. These indicators are known as IOCs, indicators of compromise. And they're basically small elements of forensics data. It could be anything. Anything that you can look for in a system or on a network could become an indicator of compromise. They're typically very tactical indicators, so they demonstrate actual behavior. They're not necessarily talking about bigger pictures and intents and plans and threat actors. They look for these specific things that you can look for. And so we want to have those indicators so that we can look for them. But we also want to, as we investigate our own issues, maybe create new indicators of compromise that we can share with others. And some of those IOCs include IP addresses, file names, URLs of websites, maybe that were used for phishing attacks or for malware drops, email addresses, file hashes or file names, maybe even host names, you name it, it could be an IOC. And then, of course, once we have a whole list of those indicators of compromise in some form of a structured and analytical format, we can start looking for them, for instances of them on our own network. Now that we have a way to figure out what threat intelligence is, how those indicators are created, we can start using those indicators and maybe create them. A fairly relative newcomer to this field is called deception. No, I should say the term deception is relatively new, but the practice has been around for quite a while. What we've been trying to do is look for adversarial behavior and then hopefully catch the adversary in our networks quick enough that they cannot get to a real target. So at that point we would have prevented a data breach, even though our system's protections may have been bypassed or partially bypassed. One of the techniques we have is to implement targets, traps throughout our network. And that basically means systems that look like they might be valuable, that they might contain valuable, systems that look like they may have open vulnerabilities on it. And then hopefully the idea is that we draw the attacker to those systems, which of course are systems that we are going to monitor very, very closely for signs of those attacks, so that it takes longer for the attacker to get to the actual systems with the actual data. And by doing that, we have a chance to learn the attacker's methods and techniques, but also we have a chance to shore up our defenses and in general just get rid of the attacker altogether. Those systems are called honeypots. And so those are systems that look interesting to the attacker, but they are decoys. They're used to divert the attacker away from the actual target, to delay the attack, because we could make, for example, a honeypot respond relatively slowly, and of course, so that we can learn through observation on what the attacker is doing. Honeypots come in multiple shapes. Pure honeypots would be actual systems that we've built and put on our network. So, here is a new Windows Server instance, here is a new Linux box, and we're going to very closely watch the network traffic going in and out of those systems. There is no legitimate use for those systems, so by definition, any traffic going to or from them is suspicious. But the problem, of course, is that if an attacker is able to execute a successful attack, now they do have a foothold in our internal network. Even though the system might not have any real data on it, they can still use it to pivot their attack. The second stage is a high interaction honeypot, and those offer services, but they simulate providing them. So for example, it might be a system that pretends to be a web server, but it's not really serving up any dynamic content or actual web pages. It has a number of predefined responses in it. From the attacker's perspective, it looks like a real web server until they start poking a little too hard, and then they're able to find out. Of course, less risk for the organization that it gets compromised because it's not a web server, but still quite an overhead to build those things. And then lastly, we have the low interaction honeypots, which simulate offering services, but they also don't provide them. So they might, for example, have a TCP port 80 open for incoming traffic. They might send back some HTML, but the only page they send back is 404 not found. That's fairly simple to set up and run. You can build something like that in maybe 20 lines of Python code. But who knows, maybe it is something that you can build a honeypot on. Honeypot technology has always been, well, always is a long time, but it has been around for a long time. It's never really taken off. There are some commercial offerings out there. Things Canary is a company that does this, but they have not become widespread for a number of reasons. Another form is IP dark space. Organizations typically have more IP address space than they are using. For example, we at Adelphi use the entire 10 dot something range as an internal network, and then we do address translation on the perimeter firewalls to map it to our publicly routable IP addresses. But it also means that we could be setting apart large chunks of that IP address space to purposely not be used. But it also means that if I then see network traffic going to those IP address ranges or coming from those IP address ranges, there's something really wrong, because we just decided that we weren't going to use it. Yet we're seeing traffic to go to or from it. And again, that's a way to observe and to detect early warning systems. And there's IP dark space everywhere. It's a useful observation tool. Similar to honeypots are honey tokens. Those are pieces of fictitious data that we are planting on systems. And the idea is if we are breached and an attacker is exfiltrating data, then our IDS and maybe our DLP systems should be able to capture that data and see it move around. It also means that if we discover a data dump at some point and we find honey tokens in them, we should be able to identify what systems they come from. Of course, those honey tokens should be unique to the deployment that they're using. And then we have fake credentials. So for example, if someone sends us a phishing attack, we might actually go to the phishing site and put in a set of usernames and passwords that are unique to that phishing site that will authenticate against our infrastructure, but that don't give any access. And that means that we can now watch for the use of those credentials. If we see someone log in with that username and that password, we know that it must have come from that particular phishing attack. Let's say that we see that login coming from a specific IP address. Now we go look and say, what other logins did we see coming in from that IP address? And at that point, we might discover more compromised accounts. It also gives us an indicator of compromise. That IP address is used by a phishing attack to test credentials or to gain access to systems. So now we have the diamond model in there again. All of those things start fitting together in a more active way of defending our networks, rather than just sitting back and waiting for the IDS and IPS alerts to trigger. A little bit of an odd duck in here, but vulnerability scanning is an active activity, and so I listed it here. We want to scan our own infrastructure before the bad guys do and discover any problems so we can fix them. And that's called vulnerability scanning. So we will scan our network, we will look for known vulnerabilities, and we will hopefully remediate those vulnerabilities to the best of our abilities. What's interesting to keep in mind is that we can do two types of scans. We can do credentialed scans and we can do uncredentialed scans. When we do an uncredentialed scans, we're looking at the system from the outside in. We're looking at what ports are open on that system, what services it's providing, what software it's using, all the typical things that we have done earlier in this semester ourselves. But we can also do a credentialed scan, in which case we're looking from the inside out. We actually have a way to log into the system and actually see exactly what software is running and exactly what services are up and running and exactly see what firewall configurations were applied locally to the systems. And we can use that to alert on problems. Obviously, a credentialed scan gives more reliable result than an uncredentialed scan does, because you're actually looking on the system and seeing what's running. The disadvantage is, your vulnerability scanner will have to be able to log into those systems, which is a potential vulnerability in its own right. So when we talk about minimization of attack surface, it's always a little risky to figure out, are we going to do credentialed or uncredentialed scans? The systems that would benefit it the most are also the ones that would be at the most risk from compromise. So we're always trying to figure out exactly how we're going to fill in those determinations. And then the vulnerability scanners, of course, don't fix anything. They just report. And typically a security analyst will interpret those reports, will prioritize findings, and then we'll work with security engineer or system administrators to remediate. They typically do that through patch and configuration management. Patch management is all about getting software updates out to the endpoints and applied in a timely fashion. And so we need to know not only what software is installed on those endpoints, we also have to then know what those patch levels are that the vendors provide, and then we have a way to deploy them. Patch management and vulnerability scanning are two sides of the same coin. Patch management should be proactive. Vulnerability scanning typically is then an audit control on the patch management if it's done correctly. If it's done incorrectly, patch management is responsive, which means that it will only kick in when vulnerability scanning has failed. Ideally, you don't want to be in that case. Ideally, you want to be in a situation where your vulnerability scanner is going to confirm that your patch management was working correctly. This gets complex very quick, especially when you start scaling this up, when you may have hundreds, if not thousands of computers, of different operating systems, different software versions. Patch management becomes hard and is not something you can rely on through manual processes. It has to be automated. And then configuration management is the other part, the third side of the coin, if you want to call it that, which means that just getting the patches onto a system is not good enough. We need to make sure that those systems are configured appropriately with the right group policies, with the right configuration options. And that's the job of configuration management, where system administrators are able to configure baseline config standards centrally and then push them out to endpoints and also audit against those situations. So we want to know through a configuration management system like an SCCM or a Jamf or any of those, what assets do we have? In other words, what computers are checking in with us, which also means that we hopefully know which ones are not. What should they be configured as? Are they meeting those configuration standards? If not, bring them into compliance, but also trigger an alert to the security team that can then try to find out why they aren't in compliance. And so between patch management, between vulnerability scanning and configuration management, some of your basic security hygiene can be done proactively. Then lastly, one of the newest comers to the market is threat hunting. It's still not 100% positive whether or not this is going to be a marketing term that kind of silently disappears, but there's still a lot of chatter in the field. And basically the idea is that it's nice to do vulnerability scanning, it's nice to do all of that, but it all relies on signatures that were pre-configured by vendors of things that might be going wrong. How about we start actually using real threat intelligence to look not for things that might be going wrong, but for things that we know have gone wrong. And that means that we're going to actively start looking for signs of compromise in our network, that we're starting to actively look for, if we would be attacked using this capability, what would we be finding on our systems? Would that mean there's certain types of malware on our systems that our virus scanners maybe don't recognize? Or maybe there are configuration settings changed that we didn't know about before then. And the big drawback or the disadvantage of threat hunting is that it really requires some significant knowledge of the technologies that are in place in organizations, but also that you have to have very detailed knowledge about how attackers are working and what it is that they're doing. And while that latter is often provided by cyber threat intelligence, the former might be provided by threat modeling, it's still something that is primarily at this point in the game a manual process. Yes, there are vendors out there who claim to be selling threat management platforms, threat hunting platforms, but in reality they're often just configuration baselines. So how does it work? One, we can go hypothesis based, which basically the example I just gave, like, hey, if we know that we have an attacker that works like this, let's take on the hypothesis that says we have been compromised. Can we test this? Can we find evidence for the fact that we have been compromised? Not finding that evidence doesn't mean that we haven't been compromised, but at least it gives us some reassurance. And so we can go using CTI, operational threat intelligence, and look for those indicators of compromise in our network, where maybe our intrusion detection systems and our endpoint protections like the EDR systems haven't gone yet. The other one is using mapping CTI to that environment. So at that point we are looking for a little bit more concrete signs. And then the third one is to use machine learning, which seems to be all of the rage at the moment, where we're saying, okay, well, we can just observe your network for a while. Assume that while we're observing, nothing bad is going on, so we have a known good baseline. And then going forward, compare the known good baseline against what we're seeing. And as soon as we start seeing significant anomalies, we may have a compromiser. In reality, there's absolutely truth to this. This is a valid approach, especially if you start combining the three mechanisms. However, always keep in mind that cyber threat hunting is a very advanced strategy. It's not something you should start with. It's something you should do after you have all of your other protective and response capabilities in place. Because in the end, threat hunting is going to find indicators that you have been compromised. If you don't have your incident response processes in place, if you don't have your protective controls in place, if your architecture is lacking, you know that you've been compromised, but you can't do actually anything about it. So we want to make sure that we have our basic hygiene in place from a cyber defense perspective. Then we can start considering cyber threat hunting, but we have to realize that it is hard to do, it is a manual process, and it is a fairly expensive process. So these were some of the proactive cybersecurity measures. These are good to know from a defensive perspective. They're also good to know from an offensive perspective. If I am paid to be a penetration tester, for example, you could say that is a form of offensive strategy and proactive defense as well. If I can use some of these methods and techniques that are described here, I might be more successful in the long run.